know what that means.
I
Uh,
thought you were gonna say like an in-depth knowledge of the NFL. Like she was gonna
Yeah.
start going off on like plays. Then you went to mob gambling. Like
welcome to the
okay,
new Sunday Superversive live stream. I am your host, Benjamin Wheeler, and today we are discussing Paper Doll Veronica with the creator, Mary MacArthur. Mary, how are you doing today?
I'm doing good, thank you.
Excellent. And of course, I am, as always, joined by Anthony Marquetta. Anthony, how are you doing today?
I've never been better in my life.
Fantastic. Well, uh, I adore Paper Doll Veronica, Mary. It is my favorite thing on Arcaven, uh, which is where everyone should be getting their comics these days. Uh, I enjoy the paper doll aesthetic. I enjoy the whimsy, the mimsy, and even the flimsy of the paper. Uh, you've got a great little thing going on here. Why don't you tell us about it, uh, and we'll go from there.
Well, it started out with I was drawing a normal comic, a Batman fan comic, and my brother said, um, "Make this easier. You could do it as a sprite comic, and people would take pixel art from video games and the characters in different poses and make a comic out of that."
Right.
And I was like, "How would you do that if it's not digital?" And I just kept thinking about it and thinking, "Oh, paper dolls." And I saw, I think on Etsy, someone making paper dolls with brads to hinge their limbs so that they could move, and that gave me the idea. Uh, and so the it's been going. I think I started posting it in 2019 on my own website, paperdollveronica.com. And the story started off there's this girl in a fancy dress, and then she gets kicked out of her house by 7 animals and has to go on a journey. And I was building towards a wizard casts a spell on all her dresses so that they become magical. Because a paper doll, it's all about changing the outfit. And then each dress acquires a power to kind of be like superpowers and allow her to get through her various adventures.
Excellent.
and, and so now I finished I finished posting 2 parts. It's book 1, it has 7 parts. And part 1, forest, and part 2, mountain, are all complete. And as I was nearing the end of mountain, I thought, um, well, because of the way I do it, I take I make a collage of a background for the various scenes, and then I just, for each frame or panel, um, pose the dolls and lay down any props and speech bubbles cut out of white paper for each page. And so, and then for the next one, I move them around and they're doing various things. But that means that unlike a normal comic drawn on paper, I don't have each image physically permanently because it was just the scan of the dolls in a certain position.
Right.
And I mean, I know that a lot of comics these days, they're digital, so there isn't a physical original. But I get antsy when I don't have a physical original. So I wanted to make print books so that it would just, if the internet went down tomorrow, it could exist physically and remain. and
Right.
that's what this crowdfund campaign is all about.
I like it. Uh, like I've said when I started, I'm adoring the style. I like it. I like all the pieces to it. Uh, just the premise itself of going around with uh, try and get your home back with magical dresses and what. Oh wait, not that part. Uh, but I like the characters and just kind of the interest put into it because it's got a wholesome feel to it. It's very superversive, very nice in ways that, quite frankly, we just don't get, even from other groups of our side. Like, I don't care to read Cam in America or some of the stuff that kind of reads like revenge fantasy on
Hmm.
different people. And it's not that it's poorly written or anything like that. It's just, mm, you know, can't get into it. Um, and it just feels so much better.
Well, and I find it kind of strange and like ironic, but also okay that the alternative comics conjures up images of nasty 80s underground things, but though some of them weren't nasty, but a lot of them were.
They were.
But the 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 movement part of it calls itself Comicsgate, and there's Archaven and various things. That some of it came from more the political side of it had these woke messages in
Mm.
the mainstream comics, and some of it just came from, well, with the woke messages there was this feminist pseudo puritanical crackdown on the beautiful scantily clad women in comics.
Right.
And so a lot of these independent comics that have been breaking away from the mainstream have just been about scantily clad women, and it's like that's not at all what I'm going for. And it just sort of strange bedfellows, strange allies between the people who didn't want uh, perverse messages of the woke variety in their comics, and people who wanted scantily clad women in their comics.
Right.
Yeah, it's something you notice in the indie scene, right? Like people take the opportunity to be like, and you'll sometimes see it on like what I would call the fake right of people going like, the left thinks it's woke if you include lingerie clad women, so we're gonna do it to own the libs. And then
Mm-hmm.
you will get like a subset of people cheering over this. Yeah, I find it pretty disturbing. I think that Ben is on the same page as me on this, though. Of
Yeah.
course, he can speak for himself. Uh, but it's one of those things where it's like, no, I'm not at when that happens. I tend to go like, I'm not allied with those people. Now, I do admit that there is sometimes a literary, there can be a literary purpose to portraying things like debauchery and degeneracy, as long as they are shown to be debauched and degenerate, and are not meant to be titillating, right? But and there is a certain like I could see where the bedfellows came in because there's on one hand there is a denial of sex at all, right? And I mean sex as in biological sex, male
Mm-hmm.
and men and women, you know. So this idea of acknowledging like that beauty exists even, right?
Mm-hmm.
So
Hmm.
you get this weird reverse image where you show scantily clad women and then going like the libs hate this and there's a truth to it, but it's a distorted truth, right? Like it's through a glass darkly.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Because the libs loved it, as little as 10 years ago. And it's, it's not like they changed. It's just that, Satan's tactics, went from like stage one, get them to drop their morals, and then stage two, um, get them to abuse themselves, and so on and so forth. Like it was shocking because Um, Mardi Gras just happened in Soulard in St. Louis, and I worked it, and there were many fights, and there were many other, horrible things no Christian should get involved with, which is, of course, why I enjoy throwing them out of my bar. Uh, but they didn't become better versions of themselves in the party. They became lower, debased, whatever virtues they have, leaves them. Um, and then you see, basically four women screaming at me why they can't go up to the upstairs, to be on the balcony and get them photo ops for free, when it is clearly an extra $20 to go upstairs. Yes, they were very noble creatures there. I could really see my fellow man shine brightly in them. But it's all part of the same lineage. As much as we might like destroying the ugly things and throwing down um, the high places where we find them uh, when we can, it is also important to build up things and create art like Paper Doll Veronika, uh, that is wholesome and good and the very example of how things should be. Unless you're, of course, planning a late stage switcheroo, um, you know, self
Well, that
indulgent. Yeah,
is.
sorry.
But I wanted. I have my warning for parents of what sort of things, because I'm very happy to learn that a lot of girls around 7 to 10 years old are enjoying Paper Doll Veronica. And so I thought I better write just a warning so that there are no nasty surprises, because people don't always agree on what's appropriate for children.
Mm.
I very much, it is my goal for it to be appropriate for children. Um, but like I did a coloring book of Catholic saints for every single day of the year, and there were some, and it was published by Sophia Institute, and I'm very
Oh
grateful for
wow.
them for publishing it. But there was a little difficulty along the way, a little creative uh, differences that we came to agreements on. That for martyrs, I was drawing more violent pictures than they wanted me to, and
The full
because
skinning of that one saint who lost his skin. Just like in perfect, anatomically correct detail. Yes.
Yeah, there's a stat. I know who you're. I think it was like Saint Bartholomew or
Yes, I
something.
think
There's a
that's it.
statue of him. Yeah, there's a statue of him in Rome, like holding his skin.
mhm.
Great
I didn't
children's
go
book
that
fodder.
far, but yeah,
Oh.
because growing up, I didn't uh, violent things. I mean, not terribly graphic, but just like violent fairy tales in particular. That some parents, the old versions, don't want their children. We were not shielded from that, and I never had a problem with it. But
Mm.
since I want to respect the authority that each parent has to decide what. So wrote this warning, and I think I say there's a fair amount of violence, usually represented by a doll getting torn and a small splat of red ink on red paper blood. And the word damn is used a few times. And but I really didn't want any kind of sexual immorality. And the there are two examples that there is a person who is said to be, she's the illegitimate daughter of this man. He had an affair. And then there is a time where a guy, it's rather humorous, but a guy, all these people are giving gifts to this prince, and this one guy says, here's a gift for you, a wife. And it's his wife. He doesn't want her anymore. But here, the prince can marry her. And this is said to be wrong, but those are the two times that there's sort of naughtiness coming up, and I wanted to let the parents know. And but there is there is violence and dark stuff and scary stuff. Um,
Oh, of
but very
course.
much, I think in the pattern of like old Brothers Grimm fairy tales.
And of course, the real world is itself dark and grim, and so on and so forth, as we all well know. By the way, the self-indulgent comment was me reading a comment from Maggle Maxis, the
Mm-hmm.
alternate comics, which revenge fantasy, as if it were photo negative of Reddit carnage. Self-indulgent, maybe. I said that in reverse, but whatever. Uh, yes. So, oh yeah, I see it. And let me tell you, at least as a adult man, a boy, in fact, uh, the violence is fantastic. Just say it's tasteful, organic to the story.
Mm-hmm.
There's a big difference between inorganic and organic violence, just in the same way as we might say for organic or inorganic sexual morality. Uh, there's a time and place for everything, but there's a difference between murder and a justified something 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 that happens to a villain in the second to last comic on Arcaven, um, which is fantastic, by the way. And the uh, murder, I guess, cold murder, like you're in a Game of Thrones episode.
Yeah, I'll also say too, like this is something that you'll sometimes see from I want to say leftists, and I feel like that's a little bit too limiting of a word. What's the best thing I could think of to describe the group of people I'm talking about? Like so I'm going to use leftists, even though note that I think it's probably a little bit too limited. But you'll sometimes hear from leftists that like, oh, if I remember reading this actually on old review of It's a Wonderful Life. Somehow they brought this up, even though it has nothing to do with the film whatsoever. But it came up on as like I don't know why the Catholic Church, and they specified the Catholic Church, by the way, again for no reason that I could think of, but why the Catholic Church is concerned with people showing, certain women showing their assets, but they're not concerned, with showing particular acts of violence or immorality, which of course leaves aside the fact that while violence can be enjoyable to watch when done correctly. Think of John Wick, think of all sorts of action movies and whatever, right?
Mm-hmm.
Uh, any number of things. Well portrayed sex is causes arousal,
Mm-hmm.
which is a fundamental difference in the two types of acts that I think can't be forgotten. You can be more graphic with your violence. Now, that doesn't mean that there's no limit on what you should show, right? I
Yes.
think there should be some limit eventually on what you can show, but I think it's just an absolute truth that you can show more graphic violence as opposed to graphic sex, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because there isn't the risk of essentially turning it into actual porn. People will use, metaphorical things like, oh, it's violence porn, but it's not porn, right? It's not going to arouse you. You know,
Tempting the audience. It'd be a very particular sort of portrayal of violence that would tempt the audience to violence, but a lot of portrayals of lewd things will tempt the audience to impurity.
exactly. That's why even if you're portraying it, like, you got to be very careful with how it's portrayed. One of my favorite guests on the show, Ben probably knows who I'm going to bring up, was an author who goes, wow, I just blanked, J. Manfred Weichel. Uh, Now he writes books that are extremely crude, and the reason he was so fun to talk about is because I wanted to talk to him after I read one of his books, and Ben saw his body of work and like warned me basically. It's like if we're going to talk to him, then you better make sure that he can justify himself, right? And
Mm-hmm.
I told him this. I said, "So we're going to talk to you." I said, "Ben agreed, but I'm going to kind of grill you. Like, I'm not going to be mean about it, but I am going to kind of push you." And I did. I pushed back on him and be like, "Okay, so why did you choose to do this?" And what was so interesting about his interview is that he needed to justify the decisions he was making on grounds that weren't, well, people like sex, right? That's not an acceptable answer to either of us, right? Like, that would not have worked. And he did, to his credit, right? He was like, I'm trying to make a point about the gravity. I'm trying to make a point about the evils of this culture, showing how, like, various things. Now, in that sense, I think that there's a certain market, but you got to be very careful with how you do it. And there is also a time and a place. It's a very specific time and place, right? Like, I don't want people to be able to just go into even his books. I wouldn't necessarily want people to just go and see it sitting there on a shelf, right? Like, there is a certain time and place that you should be able to see this, and it's not going to be all the time. You know, you got to be careful with it. This is Merg Magloramaxis says, I love how wholesome everything here is. Um, yeah, I want to be specific with this because I'm trying to be very serious in the sense of, like, if we're being wholesome, I'm not being wholesome in a gentle way. I'm being wholesome because I think it's important to be wholesome,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like,
Hmm.
this is not an idle thing. This is something I take very seriously.
Mm-hmm.
You understand what I mean?
I think, and like, there's a kind of thing that might be called wholesome, but it's really just bland,
Yes.
and we don't want to do that.
Yeah, exactly. Like, that's the thing too, that in Pinkerton's Ghost is a horror series. Now, the other day I was going over with family and just having a conversation. I was going through my top 10 movies, and in my top 10 were two horror movies, Jaws and The Thing. Now, neither of them included particularly sexual horror, and that's probably not a coincidence. It's just not the sort of thing that I enjoy anyway, right? But nevertheless, like, you need to be able to portray horror in fiction. That's a part of life. Like, it is an aspect of the human experience that is real, right? We can't just ignore it. That doesn't mean that all ways of portraying it are always going to be acceptable, but it can't be completely ignored.
Mhm. And I've been kind of in a for the past few years, and kind of in a questioning dilemma about what is referred, not horror per se, but what is referred to as dark type of things in dark works of art,
Hmm.
like
Like
sort of.
grim dark, you're thinking of maybe.
I'm not sure, but like that sort of embrace creepiness, um, like a Tim Burton type of thing,
Right.
or gothic things, and just learning that a lot of the gothic things that I had liked in my youth, like I think Tim Burton, were actually trying to normalize bad things.
Yes.
And I'm trying to figure out what is the real place for dark stuff and creepy stuff, and trying to figure that out.
That's a good question,
Like,
actually. And
I didn't
go
know
ahead.
if many people know about this, but that one might be able to tell from looking at the dresses in Paper Doll Veronika that I'm highly influenced by the Japanese elegant gothic Lolita fashion,
Hmm.
which I participate in myself, and that is something with a history of like associated manga are very dark and like, oh, Victorians poisoning each other, that insanity and that sort of thing. And I'm trying to figure out what's the proper place for that sort of thing.
The sad thing is that in my life, my sister has not found a husband or anything. I might never be a mad uncle.
Uh,
I did. I did have a great grandmother who was committed. Uh, but yeah, that's just a sad story. She might.
yeah,
Mm, anyway,
the place of gothic novels would be that sort of thing, the mad relation in the attic and all.
Well, my mother and I have a very morbid sense of humor, so I joke that when I make my fortune and so on and so forth, and have my own house and place, I will hide her in the attic with all her books, of course, so that she may putter around and be mad and so on and so forth as she pleases. And that's the sort of thing. Like people look at Adam's family and go like, oh, they're this or that, they're very goth or whatever. But then like in actuality, Gomez is an absolute stallion of a Spaniard and loves on his wife in a very open and flagrant manner. And even though she is herself very well reserved, there is a solid bit of the reservation absolutely loves when he hears French and starts kissing her arm and stuff like that. There's a very wholesome relationship there that has all the trimmings. It's just that they live in a spooky mansion. Um, it's similar with some of the other stories. Like, how do you do a wholesome gothic Lolita story? Everyone is so fancy they must have complex characterization. Except when they say complex characterization, they just mean murder or something.
Yeah.
Um, I'm sorry though to say, Mary, but I'm a Gyaru supremacist.
Oh. Yeah, and I didn't actually like a lot of the Gothic Lolita manga because there were uh, no heroic or noble
Mm.
characters. Everyone is just pretty much
There's
fun.
also
Yeah, and
it's kind.
well,
Sorry,
there
finish
are
your
lots
thought
of
first.
stories like that. Yeah,
Oh yeah.
lots of stories where everyone is corrupt and there's no one to cheer for. I
I was
don't
gonna
like
say
stories.
there's a certain thing too where sometimes you got to be careful, and I see this more in because the Japanese in the modern day tend to be better storytellers than the West. This is not even this isn't even a commentary on morality. It's just a factual, like a point of, we're all not blind and we've noticed this at this point, right? Uh, they tend to be, not universally, be better storytellers in the West at this current point in time. Sometimes, though, they will have certain forms of degeneracy more artfully disguised, if that makes sense. So here's a good example. There's a show out right now, an anime, that's in a manga, right, called Jujutsu Kaisen. I'm not a huge fan. My sister was a big fan a while ago, and she eventually stopped watching it, though, even though it's supposed to, like, its current reputation is that's still pretty good, right? Like, so I was curious. I asked her, why did you stop watching it? Like, I just never, I haven't watched anime recently just for time reasons. Like, it's not that I have a problem with it, I just haven't had the opportunity to. Yeah. And I asked her about it, and she said it got too nihilistic. And I said, I don't know, what do you mean by that? I'm confused because like Ben and I are big fans of Chainsaw Man. Now, Chainsaw Man is extremely bloody and extremely violent, and even has like some sexual content in it. But I would argue it is very much not nihilistic, right?
Mm.
Like, in fact, this is a point of like I strongly would disagree with that. And if it were, I would go so far as to say it would one be much worse, and
Mm.
two, I wouldn't be reading it, right?
There'd be no
Like
point to
what
read it.
makes yeah, what makes Chainsaw Man so interesting as a story is that it's very dark and very brutal and even at times very depressing, but it's ultimately life affirming, right?
Mm.
So I was curious what's different about Jujutsu Kaisen. And my sister's response was it just got so nihilistic. And I said, what do you mean by that? Because fundamentally the story of some form of demon is around, an organization is formed that is created to stop them, is a very, very stereotypical story in anime. I could think of like 4 or 5 manga or anime with that same basic premise, all very different from one another, but with the same basic idea, right? Uh, so the when you get to like Jujutsu Kaisen, she said, okay, so there's a movie, Jujutsu Kaisen Zero, I think it was. I could be wrong about the title. Doesn't matter. Uh, but there was a there was a movie, and she said I watched the movie and it was good and it was entertaining and it was like two people going on a journey. But then at the end of the movie, like after everything was resolved and it looked like things had gone well, then everyone died and it was just the end, right? And she's like, and that's how. And then it was just like, well, then what was the point of all of that, right? Like, why'd I even watch this movie? And then I understood her point, because you can contrast this with the ending of part one. I'm going to spoil it, sorry, but we're in a discussion of literary stuff, and also, to be honest with you, for people who are listening who are like, "Oh no, he's going to spoil Chainsaw Man," read it anyway. I'm not really going to give away the impact. I unfortunately have to spoil it to make my point.
Mhm.
Otherwise, I wouldn't. But read it anyway. You'll still enjoy it. Anyway, so spoiler warning for Chainsaw Man if you want to cut ahead of 60 seconds or so. So in Chainsaw Man, at the end of the story, Chainsaw Man is notorious for it will kill off anybody, right? Like, so many of by the end of the first part, we're now in the middle of part 2 of Chainsaw Man. By the end of part 1 of Chainsaw Man, literally all of the main cast almost has been replaced except for the protagonist, right? They've all died off, right? And you would think, okay, well, doesn't this then open it up to the same sort of criticism as Jujutsu Kaisen? But it doesn't, right? So Chainsaw Man has this absolutely brutal chapter, one of the most famous chapters in modern manga, right? Like, if you talk to people who have read it, they will immediately know what I'm talking about when I go the chapter of Chainsaw Man. And that's where the villain reveals herself as the villain. You've kind of known for a while, but she officially reveals herself to the protagonist that she is the villain. Then she reveals that the entire thing has been her plan to get the protagonist, Denji. She realized that he could be a very powerful pawn if she could control him, but he had no attachment, so there was no way for her to control him. So in order for her to truly control him, she was going to get him attached to people, gain a family, grow to love them, and then kill them. And that's what she has been doing throughout the arc. So she's responsible for the death of his brother. And then, just to hit it home, she invites someone who's essentially become like a sibling figure to Denji to her house, and she opens the door and she cuts her down while Denji watches and says, "Right, she's dead. Right? Now you have no attachments. I've taken them all away from you." It is one of the most horrifying chapters in any manga, probably ever. Uh, legendary moment. So you go from there and you go, okay, if it ended there, I would agree that this was a nihilistic story, but it doesn't end there. The story continues. And we see that person who she just killed. Denji travels to the afterlife because of the Chainsaw Man. It's a manga, so it has all of these mechanics, right? He ends up in the afterlife temporarily, and he meets her there. And the person who was just killed, her name is Power, and she tells him, when you go back, he goes, I'm actually a devil, right? In the world of Chainsaw Man, I classify as a demon or a devil. So I'm gonna get revived one day, but I'm not gonna have my memory. Find me and become my friend again. Make me Power again, and don't you dare give up. I'm not that important, right? Live your life. And then Denji is revived, and he comes up with a plan to defeat the villain. So Chainsaw Man ultimately reaffirms, like, the idea behind everything that's happened is that just because Denji has suffered these horrible losses, it doesn't mean that the life that he built wasn't worth something, right? It was worth living. Jujutsu Kaisen makes a point of ending it there, right? It ends it with the loss. It doesn't show the after, it doesn't show the recovery, it doesn't show the meaning,
Mhm.
right? It doesn't show, and I think that's the difference. You need to show that there's meaning to it. That Denji might have lost the people he loves, but the mistake is in thinking that those attachments, that love, is just going to not mean anything to Denji. It's only a negative experience, right? It's only a bad memory, but that's not how attachments work. It's not only a bad memory, it's something that helps you grow and become a better person, right? And that's what Denji discovers, and they give you that sense of hope. Jujutsu Kaisen cuts it off. And it's fascinating to me because Jujutsu Kaisen, by all accounts, is a very well made piece of media. I watched a little bit of the first season of the anime, and it was well done, very well animated, very, good characters, right? Just overall, it's a good story, but there's something sinister about it in a more subtle way,
Mhm.
if that makes sense.
Mhm. Yeah. Because sometimes people seem to get the impression that if the hero dies, that makes the work nihilistic by by definition. But no, it's pointlessness that makes the work nihilistic. So if the death was, say, self-sacrificial to achieve the defeat of the villain or something,
Right.
then if it had meaning, then it's not nihilistic.
Right.
Right,
There,
exactly.
there's a spirit to things, and the spirit is my death has meaning or no meaning. In Chainsaw Man, every death has meaning, and there's a direct hand guiding it through, not counting the author. Now, the real question, Paper Doll Veronica, why'd you kill that one guy who was proposed to the one-eyed sister? I was down for it.
It, that was well, and this is something that is, I think the beast heads is an area where it will get very dark,
Fair.
and I want it to be creepy and dark, and just because of story reasons and because of how introducing this phenomenon, this magical phenomenon that is meant to be quite horrific, um, only one of those guys could survive. And honestly, I was influenced by in Samurai 7.
Mhm.
What's his name? The one that's the one in Seven Samurai. He's played by Toshiro Mifune.
The main character, the leader.
Well, not the leader, the one who was just a peasant. And in
Oh, I know who you
Samurai
mean.
7, he's gotten a robot body. And is it Kikuchiyo?
I haven't seen that show in a decade.
I haven't seen the anime. I have seen the original film, so
Yeah,
I know who the character is, which is
yeah,
kind of
mhm,
funny.
Yeah.
But
yeah. Well, in the anime, at one point he says to this little girl, "Ah, you can marry me someday," and she's like, "Yay!" But then he's killed in the final battle, and it's very sad. And I was influenced by that in this case, and it was just to show that he runs into the fire, and it show the irrational effect of this beast head spell, which will be gone into in more detail later. That it's not just like turning, because we have talking animals in this story, and they're, yeah, I try to make their characterization a little simpler than the people,
I gotcha.
but and but when these people get animal heads, they don't start acting like animals,
Right.
and they're something quite different and something that's not supposed to be that way.
I gotcha.
Yeah.
I was kind of thinking it was kind of a, I guess you'd call it a reverse Narnia or something like that. They lose certain bits of their reasoning that they had as humans and become more like beasts.
Mm-hmm.
Still though, I do like that the animal heads in general.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, there's plenty of mystery and sort of hidden ideas and lore in Paper Doll Veronica that's very pleasant, including things like the Cathars, the wizards, the various fires, and um, sort of what happened to different people at different times. In fact, it seems like Veronica herself is very much locked out of the loop as she lived in her wonderful house with Petit Five, um, the traitor. Uh, and I just find it all very charming. Like, I've never really been uh, driven on by mysteries, particularly because, quite frankly, the world's full of mysteries. Like, just today, in a conversation with one of my friends, I discovered that they now use bacteria to clean up black rot in books. So if you have a
Oh.
book and you have black stains on it, there's a certain alcohol that can remove it, but it can cause a lot of other damage if you're not careful, and it leaves a residue. But this bacteria loves the black rot, eats it up, and then can be killed with UV lighting. So
Mhm.
it's not at all dangerous to the book or anything like that. Um, and it's like that's a mystery to me. It has all kinds of different ideas to it. All of a sudden, the world expands a little bit more. But if I wasn't interested in books, quite frankly, I probably wouldn't care. So it's one of those things where, uh, the charm and characterization is really pulling forward in ways that I just find enjoyable. That, along with the charming art, makes Paper Doll Veronika quite excellent. Um, let's see. Is there any connection with the beast that threw her out of her house and the beast-headed men?
Um, not not in the sense of like because of that there was a cause to it of the um like because this beast headman thing is happening, that's why they came into the house. No, there's not
Oh,
anything like that. There may be a connection established later.
sure.
It's funny that well, like you mentioned the mysteries, I'm trying to not do well, people are very critical of so-called mystery box writing, which I'm not sure I understand exactly what it is, but I'm trying not to do the whatever variety of it people do not like.
Don't you dare, Anthony. We talked about this last week.
Wait,
Well,
I'm missing something.
Oh, she talked about mystery box writing.
Ah, yeah, yep,
yeah, I'm
that's
not
true.
exactly sure I know what it is, but I'm trying not to do it. But
Where
still
the
having all these things that are just referred to and in like a casual way, like
right,
the character talking about it might know what it is, but he's not going to explain it to the audience right now, but that it will be revealed later.
we get you.
What it means. And where was I going? Oh yes, but the starting point of the seven animals kicking her out of their house, I was like, it's just honestly kind of random. They were living in her garden. They got jealous. They wanted to live in the house. And I think the sparking everything off, the ridiculousness of that works pretty well. And the fact that um, she has now encountered people who probably could easily defeat those animals, but she's determined to defeat them by their own argument. Get
Right.
seven people to live in the house.
She could just have the one guy with the sword, and you know he'll just kind of there'll be the doom music playing, and she then he comes in. Oh, it's all right, Miss Bosch, but I think we'll need to clean up a bit in a moment. And it turns out he's fought Murder Frog up and down from attic to basement. Ooh, Murder Frog,
Homicidal frog.
homicidal frog. Oh, that's right.
Yeah.
The tears I always like looking at the tears of a crowd fund. There's of course the digital copy, the book, which I think for just $10 more, getting the print as well is quite quite the upgrade.
Mhm.
Uh, though I'm sure that people have their opinions. I like having the book very much, and I like having the print as well. If you don't mind me asking, will this be a hardcover or soft cover?
Soft cover, and I'm looking at two. It says it on the page, but I'm looking at two different um, possible formats from two different printers,
Hmm.
and I'm gonna order a test copy of each and see which turns out better, and probably solicit the opinions of the backers on that, which looks better as well. Um, and then once it's decided, order enough for what's reserved, and maybe a couple extras. And something I was also thinking about, if there's, cause it just depends on how much extra money there is beyond what covers however many books are requested.
Hmm.
If but if there could be enough, if I could might go ahead and order printings of part two, because the campaign is for part one, the forest, and but if there was enough extra money
Yeah.
to order some more books for part, I might. This is something which on which I'd solicit opinions. If I should order extra copies of part one, or go on and make a book of part two. It all remains to be seen.
Well, there's always opportunities to crowdfund again once the
Mm-hmm.
first book is very successful. There's as long as you don't just turn around and immediately do book two, get into
Mm-hmm.
book three quite a bit before you do it. Nobody really minds, because it's all about how things feel on these matters. And doing it back to back is bad, but doing it a couple months ahead once everyone's enjoying part three is should be pretty good based on what other people tend to do.
Yeah,
Hmm.
I'm a thoroughly uh, thoroughgoing novice to this sort of fun thing, and it was told it wasn't ideal to start on a Saturday, and then it didn't even actually go up on the Saturday. It was delayed, but it still turned out very well, and it's done better than much better than I expected. So I'm very glad.
Right. Some of this has always felt very like heuristically hoodoo voodoo.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, it's like you really want to release on this day, and it's very much like I don't understand. It's not like my video goes anywhere, and the people who want to watch it will drop everything and watch it because that's what fans do.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, so it's like, oh no, the algorithm. But it's like if you're using something small like the not small, I shouldn't call it small, but if you use things like Fund My Comic or whatever, sure, maybe it matters in like Indiegogo where you're competing with maybe another 100 different campaigns or something, but
Mm-hmm.
you know I don't think so.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the people who really want it are going to support it regardless of if you follow the formulas, as long as you
Right.
deliver what you promise.
There was a joke that well, now that I've got my YouTube play button, I have to play by the YouTube play button rules. That includes offering the vitae of a child to Mr. Beast in return for a favorable year in the algorithm.
Mm.
And I believe it wholeheartedly. Not that I think Mr. Beast is particularly evil, but uh, you don't get that popular naturally.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Especially since he seems to be outlasting groups like Epic Mealtime and stuff like that. And it's like, either you're,
Yeah,
yeah, sorry.
No, you're right. Like what I was gonna say is there's something about Mr. Beast that I have nothing that I could accuse him of, but I just don't trust him.
It's not a very trustworthy name.
Yeah, there's that. Um,
Yes.
but there's also something very weird about the way he talks. I don't know how to describe it, except that if you ever see him, it just comes across as like everything is just slightly fake. Think
Yes.
you honestly, you know what you want to who I think of? This is gonna sound like a weird comparison, but I bet you'll get it. Mark Zuckerberg.
Oh,
No.
yes.
Like there's a little bit, which does also speak of it's quite possible, and I would say I would suspect that there's some autism there.
Suspect.
Uh, like with Zuckerberg, I think it's literally confirmed. Like I think it's just a fact that he did that he does have autism. With Mr. Beast, I would not at all be surprised. Just like Zuckerberg, there's something like he when he speaks, it's like he's mimicking the way humans talk. Like
Yes.
that's the way I would describe it. There's something off about him. And yet, with that said, I do want to make clear I have nothing to accuse him of, right? Like
Yes.
he hasn't done anything to make me go like, oh, Mister, you can't trust Mr. Beast because I don't know, his son's a coke addict and he gave money to Ukraine to cover it up. Uh, there's nobody like that in the real world, luckily.
This,
It's a
these
completely
flights of
random
fantasy,
example.
Anthony. I don't know. I don't know.
Yeah, it's just a completely random example. Picked a random country, random drug, random U.S. president named Joe Biden.
Yeah,
But
like
yeah,
I saw a video where like I was just scrolling through, and it was a YouTube short. It's like, oh, Mr. Beast, what's your most famous person? And he just didn't answer, and he went, oh wow, that's certainly a question. Oh wow, I have to think about this. I need to scroll through my phone, and then he doesn't bring out his phone. He just avoids the question for a full minute. Uh, like and not even like hiding that he's avoiding the question. It's just him just deciding, no, something's wrong here. I'm not going to answer that question, just in case I can't remember who I'm supposed to be with today. So I'm gonna and and oh wow, I have to look at my phone, and then he just doesn't look at his phone, as if he looks at his own phone. I'm pretty sure he has one of his hangers on look at it for him. That's the benefit of having a hanger on. You can tell Jeffrey, the dwarf who eats at your table or whatever, to look at YouTube shorts for you, and maybe send one of the funny ones involving cats directly to my office.
for what
Jeffrey's a
it's
good
worth,
egg.
if I had to guess on a theory as to what's up with Mr. Beast, like why he got so big and why the establishment, I would guess has something to do with. I don't know if you guys remember this. There was the whole thing where Mr. Beast pays for the eye surgeries of 100 people, and then there was like a meme going around. And to be fair, again, it was not Mr. Beast saying this. Like he didn't say anything, but the meme was like, Mr. Beast is better than Jesus. He's healed more people, and he's done right, and he's done more good, and he's helped more people. Like this was just a meme, and it was also obviously like Reddit tier atheist trolling.
Hmm.
Uh, and Mr. Beast himself was not the person who started the meme, at least not to my knowledge. It's possible that he did intentionally start the meme, but we just don't know that. But to my knowledge, he is not the person who started the meme. However, there is, in all humor truth, right? Like,
Hmm.
there is something to, like, I wonder if that's the reason, a sort of secular messianism, you know,
Mm.
that Mr. Beast is supposed to represent to distract people. Uh, but I I've never developed my thoughts. I have not done a deep dive into him. I've seen like maybe one or two Mr. Beast videos ever. So he just kind of pops up every now and then. I go like, oh yeah, isn't that the guy who just gives away money at drive-throughs? he he goes and gets a burger and then says, "Hey, want $1,000?" and he just gives out money.
You're not gonna use
That
it for heroin or crack or right? Nah, man, I'm on fentanyl already. Don't worry about it.
I wonder. Just as there were people in the Old Testament who foreshadowed Christ in their lives, like David and Moses and so forth. Maybe there are people. This might be a very. I'm not saying that anybody in particular is such a person, but maybe the forces of darkness would like there to be people who foreshadow the Antichrist whenever that person might
Hmm.
appear in a million years or whenever.
Well, one thing that some
Or
people
10
miss,
years. I don't know.
yeah, I think you're right, but there's also something to note is that one thing that people miss is that there isn't one antichrist. There
Mm-hmm.
Right.
are multiple antichrists.
Mm-hmm.
The
And I think that
spirit of
that's something that
Antichrist,
people,
etc.
yeah, that's something people forget where they're going, oh, we're waiting for the end times, the Antichrist. Like, no, people who go, X person is the Antichrist, they're often like, just, name a dictator or whatever. Sometimes they're mocked for this and sometimes deservedly. But sometimes I think there does need to be some credence paid to it of being like, well, there could be some truth to that idea of like this person is the Antichrist because it doesn't mean that they're the harbinger of the end times necessarily, but they are fulfilling the role of the New Testament Antichrist, right? Like, of which we know that there are several Antichrists, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, they might be one of them.
Well,
Now,
this is my own personal theory. This is just personal. Um, I make no claims to authoritative Bible interpretation or anything, but it's my theory that no one knows the hour, only the Father, because it is of the end times, because it is variable, because it partly depends on human actions. And
Yeah.
like there are people who were involved in its development who would have liked they would have liked it very much for a certain um, genetic therapy thing to have been the mark of the beast, without which no man could buy or sell.
mm,
But it wasn't.
Right.
They didn't, for one thing, they didn't make it so that without it no man could buy or sell. They
Oh,
tried to,
yeah,
but
they tried to.
but but they didn't succeed.
Excuse
So
me.
and there is a story, just a folk tale that said that Merlin was supposed to be the Antichrist, Merlin the magician. But a priest figured that out, that his mother was pregnant and he was going to. And so he arranged, and I know some present might not agree with infant baptism, but this priest arranged for his mother to give birth over a baptismal font, and so he was immediately baptized, and so he wasn't the Antichrist, and instead he was the great magician and brought King Arthur and all that. And I find that very interesting. It's just the idea that such things might be partially dependent on
I'll be right back,
human
guys.
free will, aided with
sure.
grace, or rejecting grace and being sinful. That's
Yeah,
just my personal
there's a
thought.
medieval legend that's somewhat similar, but this is of a person who we know for a fact was a real person. I own a biography of him, and he is a personal favorite saint of mine. In fact, it is the saint that I chose for uh, various things. So, I'm talking about Saint Vincent Ferrer.
Mm-hmm.
He is a personal favorite saint of mine, and there is a medieval legend about Saint Vincent Ferrer, uh, who is a very real person, like absolutely 100% existed, well documented. We have sermons written by him, right? Like and he was around during the Western Schism, right?
Mhm.
The that one that had the three popes,
Mhm.
and in fact, it's somewhat infamous that Saint Vincent Ferrer backed one of the anti-popes. Now,
Mhm.
he backed one of the anti-popes quite honestly, right? Like legitimately thinking he was the actual pope, and then accepting the correction when it was revealed he was wrong. But nevertheless, uh, and his by the way, the fact that he did was a huge deal because he was considered very respected and influential. Well, the legend of Saint Vincent Ferrer, it goes that when he was born, it was said that the times he was in were meant to be the end times.
Mhm.
And you could see why that would be, since this is the era of the Western Schism, right? Like it probably looked to the people of Europe like the church was falling apart. You know,
Mhm.
that surely this was going to be the moment that Christ would return. And supposedly this was the case. But St. Vincent Ferrer's preaching, his tireless preaching up and down Europe, he was known for particularly converting Jews,
Mhm.
sometimes controversially. Of course, that's in the latter days. It was not controversial at the time he did it. But uh, now, sometimes controversially, he is known for his conversion of Jews, and supposedly the actions of Saint Vincent Ferrer, he preached successfully enough to prevent the apocalypse,
Mhm.
right? Like that, it was going to happen in that time, but Saint Vincent Ferrer's preaching reversed it, right? Which is
I've not
interesting.
heard that legend before, and that's very interesting.
Yeah, I'm not sure. So Saint Vincent Ferrer is one of those holy men who became so influential and was so popular that a lot of stories started attaching
Mhm.
themselves to him. So it's hard to figure out truth from fiction sometimes with his early life specifically. Again, like in his case, I want to stress here, we're not talking about someone who was like so early in Christian history that all we really know is that they probably existed. For
Right.
example, there's a very famous early saint who Saint Joan of Arc saw visions of, Saint Catherine of Alexandria.
Mhm.
Uh, in reality, when we look at the primary sources, the best we can say is that she probably existed, and not all historians agree about that. The details
Mhm.
of her life we're not really sure. Yeah. When it comes to Saint Vincent Ferrer, it's more than he probably existed. It's like we
Mhm.
know who he was. Like he was extremely well known, extremely influential. We have writings of his. We have sermons. We can know where he lived, where he died, right? But nevertheless, it's like he was so popular that stories started sort of attaching themselves to him. So how much of them were from the time period, how much came after the fact, how much he actually confirmed, right? It's hard to say. But the thing about
Right.
prophecies in the Bible, what was that?
Right.
Yeah, the thing about prophecies in the Bible is that there are two types of prophecies.
Mhm.
Uh, are prophecies that are I know that there is a term for this and I don't know it, so I'm going to use a colloquial terms. Inevitable prophecies, right? God is just telling you what will happen, right? Like he's not quote unquote giving you a chance or whatever. The
Mhm.
the course is set. This is what's going to happen. An example of this actually would be the Passion of Christ, as the most obvious example, where to the point where at one point Peter tries to tell Christ, "Well, you don't need to do it," and he says, "Get behind me, Satan."
Mhm.
You're trying to distract me from the purpose that was set out for me, essentially. Uh, right? That's an inevitable prophecy. It's just a thing that's going to happen. There is nothing you can do to prevent it. The other type of prophecy, though, is the conditional prophecy, right? Which, again, this is probably not the technical term. I know that there is one, I just don't have it memorized. And the conditional prophecies are things like what we see in the book of Jonah. You know,
Mhm.
uh, he tells Nineveh is going to be destroyed. Nineveh repents, Nineveh's not destroyed. So the question becomes like when we talk about something like the end times and Revelation, I mean, the world is not going to go on forever. Time is a beginning, time has an end, right?
Mhm.
Like, so ultimately the world is going to quote unquote end. I
Mhm.
say quote unquote because in reality, nothing's really over, right? Everyone who has lived does live and will live,
Mhm.
right? But the world as we know it, the earth that is finite.
Mhm.
Everything around us, vanity, vanity, all is dust. However, it does raise the question of like when you read Revelation, you know, can we do something to stave off the end times? Like Saint Vincent Ferrer supposedly did, for example, uh, or not? And what does it take, right? Thomas
And at
Aquinas talked. Go ahead.
the same and at the same time, we are to pray for Jesus to come soon. So like,
Yeah, that's the other thing that's kind of curious, right? Maranatha, come Lord Jesus. We're supposed to, and Jesus tells us that he is coming soon. Now, of course, soon for the eternal God can mean just about anything because it's all soon to him. But nevertheless, right? And yeah, I don't know. It's a question worth pondering, I suppose, though. Always with the caveat that we will never know the answer unless we happen to be fortunate or unfortunate enough to live through those times,
mhm.
right? Otherwise, we're not going to know the answer until after we die, and then everybody will know. Uh,
Right, right.
then we'll all learn. Still, the question of prophecy is always an interesting one in fiction. Right?
Mhm.
Of how, what causes a prophecy? They explore it in Oedipus, they explore it in Macbeth, right? Can you stop a prophecy or can you not? And what does it mean to stop a prophecy? You know, it's such an interesting question, right? At least to
Mhm.
me, I always found it kind of fascinating, and you see this too of like various predictions that are made in the Bible come to pass at slightly later or earlier times than they're supposed to be. And this is because of the prayers of the people. And the flip side of this is that one of the things that is most fascinating about Jesus of Nazareth himself as a person, and one of the reasons that I find Christianity to be such an overwhelmingly likely proposition, right? Like, so that I'm so convinced of it, is that when you actually look into the prophecies that were pointing to Jesus and when Jesus fulfilled them, you start to realize that Jesus is fulfilling these predictions from the Old Testament that are not vague predictions. They're extremely specific predictions for very specific periods of time. It's not like a Messiah will come, right? Like,
Mhm.
that's not the prophecy. The prophecy is from Daniel, and it's the Messiah will come in the first age of the Roman Empire, essentially, right? Like, that's what Daniel is telling you when you read it. Everybody who was living at the time, all of the Jews, were waiting for the Messiah to arrive at that time, right? That the Messiah arrived. You even have like a prophecy of the death of the Messiah in certain parts of the Old Testament, like that is prophecy to happen the exact year that the crucifixion takes place, right? Like, that's one of the things that convinced me so, you know that it's so likely that Christianity is true, is that Jesus isn't fulfilling vague prophecies of a Messiah to show up. It's not like, oh, and one day Arthur will return. It would be
Mhm.
more like if you got a prophecy that said Arthur, or you had a prophecy that said Arthur will return in the first presidential cycle of a new government formed on in another land, and then during the presidency of George Washington, right, somebody rose up and said like, yeah, I'm that guy, and then started doing miracles to prove it, right, that happened to match everything that the prophecy said, right? Like, that's how specific the prophecies of Jesus became.
Mhm.
There's also a question of, whether you are being organic with your prophecies, that is to say, God inspired, or at the very least, not against what God has ordained, and like trying to make things happen inorganically. For example, Hadrian, no, it was Titus, burned down the Second Temple. during one of the many revolts the Jews had against the Romans. Well, Julian came by and decided that he would build a third temple to style on the Christians. Because at least in his mind, he had some sort of Reddit atheist going. It's like, no, you can't build a third temple to cause Jesus to come back. No, and he was plagued, according to legend, by many earthquakes and many different troubles. Uh, Nothing could stand on its own. Essentially, he was foiled at every turn, because the second he, started actually acting on his religious schism, not even well, apostatism, um, he tended to fail miserably. Uh, and he failed often and many times. He couldn't revive the pagan religion of Rome. He couldn't style on the Christians. And in the end, he died going, yeah, your Galilean is one, and not as a saved man. Um, there's also, uh, I'm trying to think, like, recently I watched a video on cults. And it's like, there's always this doomsday prophecy that the world's going to end at a certain point. Or, when I was younger, this was more popular, but it continued on, into the 2000s, where you'd get this evangelical or fundy minister, and he'd go, the world's going to end on such and such a date. And, people would unfortunately believe him. There's a great video from internet historian called "Going Camping at the End of the World" about one evangelical radio host who essentially huffed too many of his own prophetic farts and decided to, actually pin a date for the coming of Christ based on mathematics and grammary, uh, which is always bad and always a sign of a crackpot. Once they start actually applying the numbers game to Jewish letters. Uh, just those are some examples throughout history where people have made those prophecies and defied them. Uh,
I think I read about one where the Last Judgment will end at some point in the 19th century, and then that date came and went, and they said, well, the Last Judgment has begun, but God is judging people starting with Adam and Eve and going through all the people that ever existed. It takes him time to get to us.
right, of course. How could we not know this?
But he did start on that date, was the argument.
I I believe it. Totally, absolutely flawless logic. That the being outside time would need time to judge everyone. Yes, yes.
Well,
You guys have heard the Mussolini story, right? Where
Which one of several?
okay. There's one where a lady who had visions into heaven and hell and purgatory and such, saints telling her things, had a vision of Mussolini in purgatory, uh, and he said that he needed prayers so he could get through purgatory faster. She told her priest, and it got out. And then apparently, about what was it, 15 years later or something, she had another vision saying he was out of purgatory, and it's just stuck in my head now.
well, I think, and that one's I actually am willing to give the time of day to, because Saint Padre Pio corresponded with Mussolini's widow, and he gave her some words of comfort. And I told the story to my father, and he said that's kind of, because he brought up it's fiction, but still it's in Dante's Purgatorio. There's a poet, I can't remember his name, who had secretly become Christian back in Roman times, and just now, he's going to leave purgatory, and it's like 1,000 years later,
Right.
And he said it would be quite a contrast if um, that guy took 1,000 years in purgatory and Mussolini only took 15 years. And I said,
Yeah,
well, yeah, but if it is true, then wouldn't that be a great illustration of the parable about the workers in the vineyard and the ones who come early in the morning and the ones who come at the 11th hour?
It's true.
Yeah.
And you know, artists tend to have greater capacity for wickedness than even journalists, which is how Mussolini got his political start. He ran a newspaper. Uh, yeah,
yeah. The mystical experiences of so here's the thing about like mystical experiences. I agree with you in that they need to be viewed with a bit of a grain of salt. Now, I am willing to, as Mary put, I would be willing to give them the time of day, right? In that I'll listen to them, but with that said, there's a lot of sometimes you see it among really trad cat circles where there's a lot of well, a saint said it, so you really should just so we can believe it. And then if you go like, but where is there any evidence of this? Or are you going to doubt, Saint whatever, right? Like this saint or something like that.
Saint Gustav
Uh,
of Weiskopf on Avon, you know, the
yeah,
wine
and
festival
this
year.
doesn't even speak to the sanctity of the people. Like people could misread vision. People could think that
Yeah.
they had a vision and are mistaken about it. Whatever, right? These things happen, but it doesn't speak to their holiness. But sometimes you get that among like the very, very, radical traditionalist types. And there's a particular one. So I'm going to say this as a sort of olive branch because I'm going to talk about a vision of the Virgin Mary that I believe is not true, but is actually an approved vision. So consider this like this is a bit of an olive branch, uh, right? So Our Lady of La Salette, Mary, are you familiar with it?
Not terribly.
Okay. So this was one of the early ones. There's like several waves of Catholic visions. They go back to very, very
Yeah.
early in the church. Both Marian apparitions and other apparitions of various, angels and saints. But the wave of modern ones, which started in like the 1800s, I believe La Salette happened either 15 years before or 15 years after Our Lady of Lourdes, which I consider to be a much more plausible apparition. So it's kind of was one of the first to start this modern trend of apparitions. Three children went and they saw visions of the Virgin Mary. Now, the Catholic apologist Jimmy Akin has a show called Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World, where he will just take any random subject he's interested in that has some sort of mystery element and examine it. And he did an episode on Our Lady of La Salette. And the conclusions he came to were somewhat surprising. Now, at the time, the three children claimed they saw Mary in a field. She gave them several prophecies about the future, but several problems arose. So, when you look into the veracity of an apparition, there are a few things there are actual guidelines set out for like how do you determine the veracity of apparitions. One of the guidelines is the character of the people who receive them. And interestingly, the seers of La Salette did not end up living particularly holy lives. One of the seers ended up joining some sort of like radical monarchist group, got kicked out of her convent. Supposedly, she did die Catholic, but not as part of religious life. Another, unfortunately, like went down the route of like he became some sort of materialist. He had serious issues with the Catholic Church his whole life. He did end up having his heart buried at La Salette when he died, but there were other things as well. And the big one, so I'm going to start with a smaller one, which is that someone was arrested, a woman was arrested by the French government at the time, who, as some sort of imposter, who might have been pretending to be Mary in the visions. The thing is, we don't actually know anything. Like, we don't have the records, unfortunately. Right? Like, we just don't have them. So for whatever reason they were lost. We only know about the arrest. So this doesn't really tell us as much as you might think because the government was extremely anti-clerical. So it could have been they could have just picked a random person and used them to make an example. We don't know, but there's a bigger problem, right? The big problem is that the La Salette children, now we already have some holes here, right? That their character doesn't really fit when you look at, say, the Fatima children. All three of the Fatima children ended up living incredibly holy lives. Two of them died young, but were known for their sanctity. Sister Lucia died a nun and was in the church her entire life, and is now a venerable and is going to be canonized relatively soon, probably. Right? When you look at the La Salette children, one of the big issues is that they were making prophecies that were dated and that did not come true. Right? And this is the big hole in La Salette that, in my opinion, kind of blows it open. They are making dateable predictions about the future of the church, and there are things that they were saying about the future of the church that did not come true, right? And that, I think, is why, like, you will still see in particularly traditionalist communities people really hang their hats on La Salette, right? Because La Salette says a lot of stuff about, like, oh, the church, the Pope, the Rome is going to maybe go apostate or something insane like that, right? Or the church is going to go like 70% leftist. Like, traditionalists love La Salette, like, point to it all the time. The problem is that a lot of the predictions that La Salette said were going to happen, the date for them is already passed. They were supposed to happen by like 2000, right? So you got to maintain what I'm saying, I guess, is that you got to maintain a certain level of skepticism when you're talking about mystical experiences that you literally can't verify, right? Like, if if you can verify them, then we need to maintain an open mind. Like, there is a reason that the church is very careful to say you don't need to believe in a private revelation, even if it's approved. All they're saying when it's approved is we see no reason for you not to believe it. There is probably some reason for you to think it is true. It is not saying it is mandatory to believe,
Right.
right?
I one would assume that the ones that have been given feast days are like more approved, but it's still not, required.
Yeah, the feast day isn't. It's, again, it's something of a recognition of, like, okay, so the church over the years has found it to
Hmm.
be pretty right, pretty reliable. We
Hmm.
have good reason to believe at this point that what they have said is reliably true. However, let's say you're someone who looks into it and you say, I'm sorry, I've done a lot of studying on this subject and I just am not convinced of its veracity. Well, nobody can say you're doing anything wrong, right? You're not, because it's not part of official Catholic teaching. There is no doctrine that is ever going to be based on apparition, right?
Hmm.
So you got to be
Because
careful with these
the
things.
revelation of Christ is complete.
Yes,
Yeah.
you have to be careful with these things. The other thing too is that sometimes you'll see stuff like people will get stigmata, and then people will try and use that occasionally to be like, okay, so here's where the wounds of Christ must have been located, because this saint got their wound on the left side, right? So that must have been where Jesus was stabbed, right? And
Mm-hmm.
yet you will have another saint who also got stigmata who got the wound on the other side. So what do you do with that? Well,
Hmm.
there's a couple options here. One is that one of them is lying, or they had some other malady that appeared to them to be like stigmata, but wasn't actually, right? Those are possibilities.
Or I always thought, you know, they think from recent archaeological findings that people were crucified with the nail through the wrist, and you'll see some crucifixes portray Jesus like that, while the older ones always have it through the palm.
Yeah,
And
you're absolutely right.
the
I would
account, yeah,
go ahead.
and the accounts of Saint Francis stigmata are that it was in the palm, and I don't think there's good reason to doubt Saint Francis. Well, you're not required to necessarily believe his stigmata were supernatural. but that they were at least sincere, since he is a saint. But my thought was, well, maybe even if it really was in the wrist that Jesus was crucified, since at St. Francis's time they would have thought it to be in the palm, if St. Francis had been given it in the wrist, he might have been confused in such a way that would hamper the devotion and zeal that being given this grace would
Yeah,
inspire him.
that's what I was going to say. The other option here is that saints who are given the stigmata, the Lord doesn't particularly care about what side of the body the stab wound is on, right? Like, maybe depending on the devotion in the area, right, or what they are used to seeing, he
Mm-hmm.
would put it on one particular side or another. And you shouldn't be using mystical visions, and appearances to establish historical facts.
Mm-hmm.
Like, it's a very dangerous thing to do. Uh, right? Like, you got to be very careful with that.
Yeah, these things are derivative of Christ, so we shouldn't try to treat Christ as if he's derivative of them.
It's one of the reasons too that, as much as based on my study of it, I tend to believe that the Shroud of Turin is a legitimate relic, right? Like, based on what I have read and seen about the Shroud of Turin, I am mostly convinced that the Shroud of Turin was actually the burial cloth of Christ.
Mm-hmm.
As a result, I think that the Shroud of Turin is an extraordinary archaeological artifact, right? With that said, I would be very, very careful, because the fact of the matter is the Shroud of Turin has not been dated to the time of Christ. Now, it hasn't been conclusively, like, there was carbon dating, but it then came out later that it was done a part of the shroud that had been repaired. We know pretty much for a fact that carbon dating was bad. Nevertheless, it hasn't been dated to the time of Christ, right? It just hasn't. That's a fact. Unless and until it is, right? I am very hesitant about using the Shroud of Turin for, purposes of conversion, because it could easily come out that, oh yeah, by the way, we tested it, it's confirmed, it's not real. Now, that would raise other questions, like, okay, if it's not from that time period, then what on earth is this thing? yeah,
Mm-hmm.
because there's
Right.
so many strange things about it. And it would still be a very, very interesting item,
Mm-hmm.
right? It just wouldn't be a relic of Christ. And that's why with the Shroud of Turin, one thing about it though that does fascinate me is that when you reconstruct the face in the Shroud of Turin, which people have done several times, it's possible to do now with modern technology. When you reconstruct the face on the Shroud of Turin, it's amazing how much it looks like a stereotypical image of Jesus, like you would see in religious art. And I think that there is something, on one hand, if it were a forgery, which, to be frank, actually seems unlikely to me. Like, I don't even know how you would do it. But if it were a forgery, on one hand, you go, well, of course it looks like Christ. But on the other hand, it's like, well, maybe this is one of the reasons why images of Christ look the way they do, because people knew how he looked. You
Mm-hmm.
know, it's like there has to have been a chain of custody per se, right? Like a chain of, why do we make Christ look like this, right? Well, ultimately, it's because there were people who were alive who knew how he looked. You know, like, it's not like he was invisible, right?
Mm-hmm.
So there's something to the idea that the art that we have is actually uh looks like Christ, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, I probably should get going soon,
Sure.
but I think that is a good place to draw things to a conclusion because, um, well, I'll just say that's the image of Christ, as in visible image, is a very strong theme in both Paper Doll Veronica and in the Shroud of Turin is directly brought up in Clockwork Dancer, which is another comic I'm working on. that written by John De La Rose, and it hasn't come out for a couple years, but it is my goal once I get this crowdfund out of the way, and then the results of the crowdfund to make the book, and get uh, and also finish up with the current issue of comic Bovadar and the Bears. Um, to really work on the next issue of Clockwork Dancer and get that out hopefully this year.
Awesome.
Oh, and I had one more thing to announce.
Oh,
Uh, on Archaven,
Oh dear.
uh, you know that a couple of the most popular comics, Hypergamouse and Midnight's War,
yeah.
uh, have been translated into Chinese.
Wow.
I was told that the translator wanted to do Paper Doll Veronica, so that there'll be a Chinese version of that going up.
Excellent.
That was pretty exciting.
I can't read Chinese, but I,
Yeah.
If you can, it's probably cool.
yeah, I'm
Yeah.
afraid we don't have that much overlap with the Chinese, but we do think it's a great idea. Uh, I do love the fact that Vox has expanded into East Asia. The way he's done with some of the other stuff, like with Hypergamouse, because you just wouldn't expect it to be a thing, and it's certainly not what um, people would expect. But yeah, no, it's 7:40. We've talked about Paper Doll Veronica. It's one of my favorite things in Archaven, along with things like Hypergamouse and Bodavar and the Bears. Uh, do check it out. Do fund her comic. Even though she's got her money, promoting more will mean more bonuses later down the line. You do things like produce, and I definitely like my artists who produce. Do you have anything else you would like to say today, Mary?
Thank you very much to everyone who supported and everyone who listened, and you guys for having me on.
It was our pleasure.
Of
Anthony,
course.
do you have anything?
Uh, nope.
All right. Thank you all for coming in. Uh, we'll take a, I don't know, not a rest or anything like that. We're still going to stream, but we'll see what we want to talk about next week. And then we'll go from there. Thank you all and have a wonderful day.
Do 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 do.